The sun had barely crested the ridge when Emmett Parker stepped out onto the porch of his old farmhouse, boots landing with a hollow thud against boards worn thin from decades of weather and worry. Frost clung to the edges of the wood, silvering them like brittle lace, and his breath steamed in the cold air. He pulled his flannel shirt closer around his chest, though the chill wasn't what made him shiver. It was the weight of another day, another long reckoning with fields that gave back less each year, with bills piling like snowdrifts on the kitchen table, and with the emptiness of a home that once rang with laughter, but now held only silence. Laurel's ghost lingered in the rooms behind him, 2 years since the cancer took her, and still the echo of her voice followed him out into the morning like a shadow. He raised the chipped mug in his hand, the bitter coffee inside already cooling, and scanned the fields, rows of soil stretched stubborn and gray, waiting for spring, waiting for rain, waiting for luck that never seemed to come. His tractor squatted by the barn like a tired old dog, more rust than iron, more prayer than machine. Emmett had not planned to be here. Once, long ago, he had dreamed of blueprints, of engineering, of cities filled with steel and glass, but dreams collapsed quickly when his father's heart failed, leaving him with dirt under his nails and the farm's burden on his back. He was 19 then. He was 42 now. He sometimes wondered if he had lived the years in between at all, or just endured them. The low groan of gears broke the morning silence. He turned toward the road where a yellow school bus lurched to a stop. At the end of his long dirt driveway, its brakes hissed, coughing white vapor into the cold, and the door creaked open. Children tumbled out in bursts of color, their voices rising in laughter, their shoes crunching against frost. They scattered down the road or darted toward nearby homes, warmth and breakfast waiting for them. But Emmett's eyes were drawn to one small figure at the bus's steps. She was bundled in a puffy pink coat, her legs still as stone, her small hands gripping the sides of a motorized wheelchair. The chair whirred as it tried to descend the first patch of mud, but the wheels sank halfway down the slope, caught where a proper ramp should have been. The girl frowned, pushing at the joystick, but the chair only shuddered, refusing to budge. Behind her, a tall man in a driver's cap watched through the bus's wide mirror. Harold had been making this route for nearly 20 years, ferrying children through frost, storm, and rain. He knew their faces like old landmarks, knew which children carried empty lunch boxes, which wore hand-me-down coats to thin for January winds. He noticed the mothers who stood tired at the roadside and the fathers who were never there at all. Harold himself carried a weight of absence. His son, a soldier, had gone overseas and never come back. Sometimes he thought the steering wheel in his hands was the only thing that kept him tethered to the earth. He saw Maddie Lawson struggle each morning, and he always told himself he would do something, call someone, help somehow. But his grief had sealed his throat, left him watching in silence while the child fought mud with wheels too small for the fight. This morning, however, another man moved. Claire Lawson appeared, wearing her laundry service uniform, eyes ringed with fatigue. She rushed toward her daughter, fumbling to push the chair free, but she was thin, worn down by double shifts and sleepless nights. Her hand slipped on the wheels. The chair tilted, stubborn, stuck fast. Emmett set his mug on the railing and walked down from the porch. His voice, rough from years of shouting over engines and wind, carried easily. "Hey there," he called, stepping across the frozen ground. "Need a hand?" Claire looked up, startled, hesitant. Strangers were rare in these parts, and men with weary eyes could be harder to trust. But the girl tilted her head back and met Emmett's gaze. She had a crooked, lopsided smile, full of defiance and light. "I'm fine," she said with a giggle. "My wheels just hate mud." For the first time in a long while, Emmett chuckled. He knelt beside her, his knees cracking in protest, and set his strong hands against the frame of the chair with a careful rock, then a heave. He freed the wheels from the mud's grip. The machine hummed forward again, obedient now, and Maddie's laughter rang out, cutting through the winter air like a bell. "See," she said brightly. "Told you." Emmett stood, brushing dirt from his palms, and for a moment he didn't see the frost or the empty fields. He saw only her smile, and the way it carved a small, surprising warmth into the hollowness of his chest. Something shifted inside him, something long buried beneath years of sorrow. From the driver's seat, Harold watched quietly, one hand resting on the wheel, his own chest tightening. He had not expected a broken-down farmer to move where he himself had not. As the bus rumbled back into gear and pulled away, Harold's eyes lingered in the mirror, catching the pink coat, the wheelchair, and the man who had bent to push it free. Emmett Parker had no way of knowing it, but in that ordinary moment, the course of all their lives had just begun to turn. The wind rattled the windows of the farmhouse that night, carrying with it the sigh of a land that had known too much silence. Emmett Parker sat at his kitchen table, the same table where his wife once placed hot cornbread and where now only unopened. Bills and stale coffee mugs sat like squat reminders of failure. He stared at the stack of papers until the words blurred, numbers and threats all tumbling together into one unyielding weight. Yet even in that storm of dread, his mind would not stay on the farm. It returned again and again to the girl in the pink coat, the way her small hands clenched the joystick, the stubborn fight in her eyes. And then that laugh, bright and unbroken even when the mud tried to swallow her wheels. He had not laughed with anyone in years. Laurel's death had taken that from him, carved joy out of him as clean as a scythe. But Maddie's crooked grin had slipped past his defenses like sunlight through an old barn door. He kept hearing her say, "My wheels just hate mud," as if it were the mud's fault, not hers, as if nothing could keep her from smiling. By midnight, he had risen from the table. The house groaned as he moved through it, pulling on his boots, grabbing the old lantern that hung by the door. He didn't plan it. The decision came from somewhere deeper than thought. Out in the barn, the smell of hay and oil clung to the cold air. He found the stack of boards left over from a half-finished shed, warped but sturdy. His father had taught him that wood, no matter how crooked, could be bent to serve if you had enough patience. Tonight, Emmett had patience, and he had purpose. He worked until his shoulders burned. The hammer echoed like a heartbeat against the night, every strike ringing out into the empty fields. He sawed, braced, measured by instinct more than rule. Nails clenched between his teeth like he was 20 again. With each board he drove into place. He felt Laurel's absence less like a hole and more like a guiding hand. By dawn, a rough but solid ramp leaned against the barn wall, waiting to be carried. The next day, the air was sharp enough to cut skin. Emmett loaded the ramp into the back of his rusted pickup, the tailgate groaning under the weight. He drove down the dirt road to Claire Lawson's small rented house. It sagged like it was tired of standing, the paint peeling, the porch steps splintered. He set the ramp down quietly, the smell of sawdust mixing with frost, and fixed it in place. His hands trembled when he tightened the last bolt, not from cold, but from the strange feeling that he was doing something that mattered. Claire came home just as he was gathering his tools. Her laundry uniform smelled faintly of bleach, her hair damp from steam. She froze when she saw the ramp, her mouth parting in shock. "What is this?" she asked, her voice soft but trembling. Emmett wiped his hands on his jeans, avoiding her gaze. Figured that chair of hers needed an easier time getting in and out. Tears filled Claire's eyes before she could stop them. She pressed a hand against her mouth, trying to hold in the sob. "You didn't have to, I know," he interrupted, his voice gruff. "That's why I did." For a long moment she said nothing, only stood there with her eyes wet and her body shaking as if the simple ramp had lifted 1,000 pounds off her shoulders. Emmett shifted uncomfortably, never good with displays of emotion. But when she whispered a thank you, it wasn't just gratitude in her tone, it was relief. Like someone who had been drowning had found the shore. That night, Claire sat by her daughter's bedside. Maddie had rolled herself up the ramp and into the house with a cheer. The clarinet her raceway. Claire had taken a picture of her daughter's pink coat. Her hands lifted in victory as the chair glided smoothly inside. Later, after Maddie fell asleep with a sketchbook across her lap, Claire uploaded the photo and a short message to her small social media page. "Sometimes the smallest acts are the biggest gifts. A stranger built my daughter a ramp today. He gave her freedom, and he gave me hope. She thought only her family and friends would see it. But by morning, the post had slipped its way through. Cracks she never imagined. A veteran's widow shared it in a forum. A soldier commented with, 'This is what real honor looks like.' The story traveled like wildfire, leaping from one grieving heart to another until it landed in the inbox of a man who commanded armies and carried the names of the fallen in his chest like stones. Meanwhile, Emmett slept with sawdust still clinging to his shirt, unaware that the world beyond his fields had begun to turn toward him. He did not know that a convoy was already being assembled, its wheels greased, its order signed. He did not know that by sunrise his quiet farmhouse would no longer be a place the world forgot. The rumble was coming, and it would change everything. The frost had barely melted from the fields. When Claire's post began its restless journey across the country, what she thought was just a thank you to a quiet farmer who built a ramp for her daughter found its way into hands she never imagined. It was shared by an old Army wife in Ohio, who remembered her husband's last words about the men who kept watch over each other. A retired sergeant in Texas reposted it with the caption, "This is the America I fought for." By noon, the photograph of Maddie grinning at the top of her ramp was ricocheting through veterans forums, Facebook groups, and private chats filled with people who knew the cost of service. And in those same hours, Emmett Parker walked his fields, completely unaware, his boots pressed into damp soil that had yielded little last year. His thoughts still caught on numbers and debts, yet, somewhere deep in his chest, something felt lighter. He hadn't spoken it aloud, but he carried Maddie's laugh with him, like a coin in his pocket, something small and shining to rub when the day felt too long. Across town, Harold the bus driver leaned against the side of his idling bus, phone in hand. He had seen Claire's post too, though not through friends or family. A fellow driver, a veteran himself, had sent it with the words, "This hit me hard." Harold stared at the photograph for a long time. He remembered how he used to stand at his own son's football games, cheering so loudly the whole field heard, and he remembered, with equal sharpness, the day a uniformed officer came to his door. His son's life had ended thousands of miles away in a desert Harold had never stepped foot in. Since then, his voice had grown quieter. On the bus, he was the watcher, not the doer, but here was a man, a stranger, who had simply acted. No hesitation, no excuses. Guilt tugged at him as he thought of all the mornings he had watched Maddie struggle through his rearview mirror. He had told himself he couldn't step in, that it wasn't his place. But Emmett Parker had walked off his porch and into that mud as if it was the only natural thing to do. Harold's heart clenched with a mix of shame and admiration. He didn't know what to do with that feeling, so he kept driving, each stop heavier than the last stop. By evening, the story had reached farther still. Screens in offices and homes flickered with Maddie's smile and Claire's words. One particular screen glowed in a government building, where General Nathan Hammond sat behind a desk scarred by years of service. His hair was white now, his uniform traded for a civilian suit, but his eyes still carried the battlefield steel. Maddie's name struck him hard. Lawson. He knew that name. He had written it once, in a letter to a young widow, apologizing that her husband would never come home. Maddie's father had served under him, a soldier brave enough to volunteer for missions others would not. Hammond had carried that loss for years, another stone in the river of regret that weighed his chest. When he saw the photograph of Lawson's daughter at the top of a ramp, her arms spread in victory, something within him shifted. Soldiers often spoke of dying for freedom, but here was freedom made tangible in wood and nails. And it hadn't come from a general, a government, or a politician. It had come from a weary farmer whose own life had been carved by grief and hardship. By midnight, calls were made, meetings were held in hushed tones. A decision took shape in the corridors of the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Family Services Unit. This man, Emmett Parker, should not remain invisible. His act was more than charity. It was a blueprint. If one ramp could change a child's life, then what could dozens of ramps, hundreds of small sanctuaries, do for families carrying invisible wounds? The next morning dawned sharp and still, frost crackling under Emmett's boots as he stepped outside to feed the barn cats. At first, he thought the low sound rolling across the land was thunder. Then he thought maybe it was tractors, a convoy of farmers heading down the road. But it was heavier, deeper, a rumble that made the window pane shake in their frames. He set his coffee mug on the porch rail and narrowed his eyes. Dust rose in the distance, not from wind, but from wheels. Black SUVs appeared first, their windows dark, their engines growling. Behind them rolled the camouflage trucks, flags painted on their doors, the morning sun glinting off polished metal. The convoy turned off the road and into his long dirt driveway, tires crunching gravel, forming a wall of steel in front of his weathered farmhouse. The cats scattered. Emmett froze. Soldiers climbed out, boots hitting the ground in unison. Their coats bore the insignias of units Emmett didn't recognize. One man carried a file thick with papers, another adjusted the service badge pinned to his chest. And then a woman in a dark suit stepped forward, her heels sinking slightly into the dirt. She looked at him with a steady gaze, not hostile, but heavy with purpose. "Mr. Parker," she asked, her voice clear against the morning silence. Emmett's throat tightened. "That's me," he said slowly. "We're with the Department of Veterans Affairs and the U.S. Army Family Services Unit. We need to speak with you about Maddie Lawson." The words cut through the air like the crack of a rifle. Emmett's heart pounded. He thought of the ramp, of Claire's tears, of Maddie's laugh echoing in the cold. He had only wanted to help, but now, men and women in uniform stood on his land, blocking his road, as if the world had decided he had done something far greater than hammer boards together. For the first time in years, Emmett felt the ground shift. Beneath him, not from debt, not from grief, but from something else entirely. Something that carried both promise and danger. And as the convoy idled in his yard, its engines growling like a beast waiting to be named, Emmett Parker realized that his quiet life was no longer his own. The engines hummed low, a sound that seemed to press against the farmhouse walls and coil around Emmett's chest. He stood on the porch with his arms folded across his worn flannel, every instinct telling him this was too much, too strange. He was just a man who had built a ramp, nothing more. Yet the soldiers did not move aside, and the convoy did not reverse. They were here for him. The woman in the dark suit stepped closer, her polished shoes crunching against gravel. She carried herself like someone used to command, though her voice softened as she spoke. "Mr. Parker, I understand this must feel unusual, but we're here on behalf of General Nathan Hammond." The name landed like a stone in Emmett's stomach. He had heard it before on the news, on folded newspapers, muttered in the diner downtown, by veterans with faraway eyes. Hammond was the kind of man whose decisions shaped history. Why would he know Emmett's name? Behind the woman, one of the soldiers opened a folder thick with documents. Emmett caught a glimpse of a photograph clipped to the inside. Maddie, arms raised at the top of the ramp, her pink coat bright against the faded paint of her house. That picture, the one Claire had posted, was now in government files. The woman gestured toward the farmhouse. "May we come inside? General Hammond has given us direct instructions." Emmett's jaw tightened. For a moment he thought about saying no, about sending them all back down the driveway. But the convoy engines growled behind them like they weren't going anywhere, and curiosity sharp and unwelcome gnawed at his silence. Finally, he gave a stiff nod. "Kitchen's all I got," he muttered. Inside, the farmhouse felt smaller with the soldiers crowding into it. The table, scarred and littered with unpaid bills, became the stage for something far larger than Emmett could grasp. The woman laid out the file, pages spreading like wings. Maddie's picture, Claire's words, comments from strangers across the country, messages from veterans who claimed that one act of kindness had reminded them why they survived. General Hammond's letter lay on top. His handwriting was firm, almost defiant. "This is the kind of America our soldiers fought for. Acts of quiet dignity. We need this man to be part of something greater." Emmett sank into a chair, his callous hands curling around his mug of cold coffee. "I didn't do this for attention," he said, his voice gravelly. "I built a ramp. That's all." The woman leaned forward. "Mr. Parker, to you it was wooden nails. To Maddie, it was freedom. To her mother, it was hope. And to thousands of soldiers and families reading her story, it was proof that they're not forgotten." The words struck him hard because he knew what it felt like to be forgotten. Years of struggling, years of silence after Laurel's death, years of the farm sinking into debt while the world spun on without him. He had been invisible, and now suddenly eyes from across the nation had turned toward him. Before Emmett could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Harold, the bus driver, stood awkwardly in the doorway, cap in hand. He had driven up quietly, curiosity dragging him from his route. His voice shook as he spoke. "She ain't exaggerating. Emmett, that ramp meant more than you'll ever know." The soldiers turned, surprised, but Emmett focused on Harold. The man's face looked older, worn with sleepless nights and the ghost of his son's shadow. Harold took a step forward. "I watched Maddie struggle every day, sat behind the wheel and told myself it wasn't my place. I did nothing. You did. Something. That's why they're here." The admission settled heavy in the room. Carrying its own kind of confession, Emmett felt the truth of it. The way Harold's silence had matched his own all these years. Two men, each locked in grief, both too tired to move until Maddie forced their hands. One of the soldiers closed the folder and cleared his throat. "General Hammond has a proposal. He wants to partner with you to build more than ramps. He wants your farm to become the first pilot site for a program supporting military families, gardening therapy, community workshops." Mechanical training for veterans. He'll provide funding to restore the land, equipment, volunteers. But it only works if you say yes. The words hung in the air, bigger than the room, bigger than Emmett's weary life. He stared at the grain of the table, tracing scars carved by decades of meals and arguments and prayers. Could this place, this broken farm, really be reborn as a sanctuary? Could he? He looked up and met Harold's eyes, then thought of Maddie's crooked smile, of Claire's tears, of Laurel's voice that sometimes came to him in dreams. Don't let the world turn you cold. His throat worked around the lump rising in it. I ain't no leader, he said finally. The woman's gaze softened. Leaders don't always look like generals, Mr. Parker. Sometimes they look like a farmer with dirt on his boots, who refuses to let a little girl sink into the mud. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the old kitchen clock. Emmett felt the weight of the moment pressing against him, heavier than any harvest he'd ever hauled. This was bigger than a ramp, bigger than him. But for the first time in years, he felt the pulse of something he thought he'd buried alongside his wife. Purpose died at last. He nodded, his voice rough, almost breaking. All right, let's do it. Outside, the convoy engines roared back to life, as if the land itself had been waiting for his answer. And in that rumble was the promise of change, a change that would ripple through veterans, widows, children, and one weary farmer whose quiet act of kindness had ignited something unstoppable. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Emmett Parker had ever known. His quiet, forgotten farmhouse, once a place of creaking floors, unpaid bills, and the low hum of loneliness became the center of a storm. Trucks arrived first, rumbling up his gravel road with lumber, stone, and supplies that looked new, too polished to belong to his weary land. Soldiers in plain clothes and volunteers in worn jeans stepped out, their laughter and shouts filling the air that once carried only the rustle of corn stalks and the caw of crows. Emmett watched in disbelief as the old barn, which he had patched 100 times with scraps, was stripped and rebuilt in days. Fresh beams rose where rot had rolled, bright paint sealed where rain had once leaked through. Men and women, some with prosthetic limbs, some with scars running down their faces, some with haunted eyes that softened only when they held tools, worked side by side as if they had known the farm all their lives. Claire came often, still in her laundry uniform, sleeves rolled up, carrying trays of sandwiches she could barely afford. Maddie was there every chance she got, her wheelchair buzzing happily down the new smooth paths the volunteers poured. She treated the workers like heroes, drawing pictures of them and taping them to the barn wall. Her laughter chased away the weight of the past as if she had been born for this moment, for this land. And Emmett, standing in the middle of it all, felt both terrified and alive. He was no longer invisible. People clapped him on the back, called him sir, asked for his input on plans. General Hammond himself visited one afternoon, his presence towering in the sunlight, his handshake firm as stone. You built more than a ramp, Mr. Parker, he said, his voice carrying the gravity of a man used to leading men into battle. You built a movement. Now let's see it grow. But even as the farm flourished, a storm brewed beneath the joy. Not everyone in town approved. Some neighbors whispered that Emmett was chasing glory, that the farm would fail just as it always had. A local developer, bitter at losing land deals, spread rumors that the project was a publicity stunt. And through it all, Emmett's own doubts gnawed at him. At night, when the workers went home and silence reclaimed the fields, he sat by Laurel's picture and whispered, am I doing this for them or for me? Harold, the bus driver, carried his own war within. He had begun to linger after dropping Maddie off, sometimes helping carry lumber, sometimes just standing with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. One evening, as the sun bled gold over the horizon, he stayed longer than usual, watching Maddie roll across the paved path toward the barn. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. You know, he said to Emmett, my boy, he would have loved this. He came back broken from overseas, and I didn't know how to help. I just drove that bus and watched him fade. And then one day, he was gone. His shoulders shook. I should have built him a damn ramp to Emmett's chest tightened for the first time. He saw the deep scars Harold carried, scars no one in town had spoken of. Without thinking, he laid a hand on Harold's shoulder. We can't fix the past, he said quietly, but maybe we can build something for the ones still here. The words hung between them like a truce. Harold nodded, wiping his eyes roughly, and from that day forward, He wasn't just the bus driver watching from the mirror. He became part of the work, hauling boards, sharing coffee, even telling stories about his son to Maddie, who listened with the wide-eyed reverence only children possess. The project grew, and with it, Emmett's unease. Reporters began arriving, cameras flashing against his old farmhouse, microphones shoved toward his face. They wanted sound bites, wanted to call him a hero, wanted him to play a role he had never asked for. "I'm just a farmer," he told them again and again. But the more he resisted, the more the story spread because the world, it seemed, was hungry for a simple man who had chosen kindness. Then came the evening that shifted everything. Maddie rolled up to him with a sketch clutched in her hands. She had drawn the farm, but not as it was now. In her picture, there were gardens stretching in neat rows, children running, soldiers planting flowers, widows laughing under shaded porches. And in the middle, tall and steady, she had drawn Emmett, not hunched or weary, but upright, arms open wide like a guardian. She placed it in his hands without a word. He stared at the paper until his eyes blurred. "Why'd you draw me like this?" he asked, his voice thick. Maddie tilted her head. "Because that's how you look to me. You see me when other people don't. You see all of us." Her words carved through every wall he had built around himself. That night, Emmett couldn't sleep. He stood on the porch, staring at the stars, while the sounds of hammers and laughter echoed in his memory. The farm was no longer just his. It was theirs, and with every ramp, every garden bed, every paved path, he realized they were building something larger than fields of corn or barns of hay. They were building a sanctuary for the broken, a place where grief could turn into growth. But as dawn crept across the horizon, a shadow stretched over his hope. The same convoy that had first brought Hammond's offer was coming again, only this time, it carried something heavier than gratitude. And Emmett knew, deep in his bones, that the real test of what they were building had yet to come. The dawn that broke over Parker Farm was different, darker somehow, though the sun painted the fields in gold as it always had. The sound of hammers and laughter had faded with the volunteers' departure the night before, leaving behind an uneasy silence. Emmett Parker stood on the porch, arms folded, staring at the barn that now gleamed with new paint. At the fresh pots winding like veins through the fields, it looked alive, brighter than it had in decades. But in his chest, a knot had formed, one he couldn't loosen. The convoy arrived just after sunrise. Not the noisy chaos of workers or reporters this time. This was military. Black SUVs rolled first, engines growling low, followed by the camouflage trucks that carried no laughter, only purpose. Emmett's gut tightened. He had learned to read men by their walk, and these weren't here to build gardens. They stepped out with stiff movements, their boots heavy, their faces locked into discipline. General Hammond himself emerged from the lead SUV, tall and sharp in a dark coat, his silver hair catching the light. He walked with the gravity of a man who had commanded soldiers into fire and carried the weight of every name that didn't come home. He shook Emmett's hand, his grip firm, but his eyes betrayed something in unease, almost guilt. Inside the kitchen, they gathered again around Emmett's old scarred table. Hammond's 8 spread documents, but this time the pages weren't about ramps and therapy gardens. They were about land rights, funding channels, oversight committees. Emmett's farm, once a struggling patch of soil, was now being spoken of as a pilot project for a nationwide program. Emmett frowned. "I didn't sign up for committees. I signed up to build a place folks could breathe again." Hammond leaned forward, voice heavy. "Mr. Parker, this is bigger than your farm now. You've lit a fire that can't be contained. Families across the country are looking at you, at this place, and Washington has noticed." Washington. The word tasted bitter. Emmett looked at the stack of papers, his jaw hard. All I wanted was for that little girl to get inside her house without sinking in the mud. That's it. Not all this. Hammond's eyes didn't leave his, and yet here we are. The silence that followed was broken by the slam of the screen door. Maddie rolled in, sketchbook in her lap. Claire closed behind. "Morning, Mr. Parker," she chirped, waving the book. She didn't notice the men in uniform, or the tension that thickened the air. Her innocence cut through the weight like a blade. But Claire noticed. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced at the soldiers, then at Hammond. "Why are you here again?" she asked, voice sharp. "Haven't you taken enough from families like mine?" Hammond flinched almost imperceptibly, but Emmett caught it. Something was being held back. Later that afternoon, when the convoy had left, Harold came by. His bus was parked crooked at the edge of the field. The children already dropped off. He carried something in his hand, an envelope, worn and folded. He looked shaken. "I wasn't sure I should give you this," he said, thrusting it toward Emmett. "But I think you need to see it." Inside was a letter. The handwriting was rough, hurried, smudged in places where dirt or sweat had touched it. Emmett's eyes scanned the words, his heart thundering louder with each line. It was a letter from Maddie's father, written in Afghanistan, sent to Hammond years ago. In it, he had spoken of Emmett Parker, the farmer who had once fixed his truck on a freezing night by the side of the road, refusing payment, muttering only, "A man in need don't owe me a thing." Hammond had remembered, and when Maddie's story appeared online, he had connected the dots. Emmett wasn't chosen by chance. He had been seen before, seen through the eyes of a dying soldier who wanted the world to remember. Men like him. Emmett's knees nearly buckled as the truth settled on him. All this, the convoy, the project, the cameras that hadn't been born only from the ramp. It had been written into motion years before, in the last words of a soldier who never came home. Harold's voice was rough. "He trusted you before. You even knew it, and Hammond, he's carrying that, maybe too heavy. That's why he's here. Why all of this is here." That night, Emmett stood again on his porch, the fields glowing faintly under the moon. The weight of his father, of Laurel, of every year of hardship pressed against him. But mingling with it now was the weight of a soldier's trust, of Maddie's smile, of Harold's confession. He had wanted only to build a ramp, but fate, it seemed, had built something larger, something that demanded more than wood and nails. And though the farm was alive with new purpose, Emmett couldn't shake the unease. If this had begun with a dead soldier's words, what price would be demanded next? The real storm, he realized, had yet to break. The day of the ceremony dawned with a sky so clear it almost felt staged. The air buzzed with an energy Emmett Parker had never felt on his farm before. Cars lined the dirt road, news vans clustered near the old oak, and the sound of generators hummed as cameras were set up on tripods. Volunteers strung bunting across the rebuilt barn, and a makeshift stage rose from the field where corn once grew to the world. This was a celebration of a new beginning, the launch of the first Parker Sanctuary, a model for how farmland could be turned into havens for military families. But to Emmett, it felt like walking into a storm he couldn't read. His boots pressed into the soil that had once been his alone, and now the ground vibrated with the footsteps of strangers. He tugged at the collar of his shirt, the one Claire had ironed for him, and muttered under his breath, "I didn't sign." Up for speeches, Claire appeared at his side, Maddie rolling between them in her chair, sketchbook balanced on her knees. "You don't have to give them a speech," Claire said gently. "Just give them yourself." That was easier said than done. Emmett had lived most of his life in silent labor, silent grief. Words had never been his trade. But when Maddie looked up at him with that crooked smile, something in him steadied. The field filled quickly. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with widows, children clutched balloons, veterans leaned on canes or prosthetic legs. General Hammond arrived with his convoy, but this time he didn't command the space. He moved quietly, almost reverently, like a man carrying a burden he couldn't put down. The ceremony began with music and old bugles notes climbing into the air, cracked but proud. A local pastor spoke, then a widow, her voice trembling, as she described how planting a single tomato vine in the farm's garden had given her a reason to wake each morning. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras whirred, the crowd murmured, and then Emmett's name was called. He froze, but Maddie bumped her chair gently against his leg, a signal to move. He stepped onto the wooden stage, the boards creaking under his weight, and stared out at the sea of faces. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched until it seemed unbearable, and then, finally, he spoke. "I built a ramp," he began, voice low but carrying. "That's it. Wood, nails, nothing special, but it seems like it meant more than I thought." He paused, eyes scanning the crowd. "Truth is, I didn't build it to be remembered. I built it 'cause a little girl needed help, and maybe that's what all of us need. Just a hand when the mud's too deep." The words weren't polished, but they struck like hammer blows. The crowd erupted in applause, some standing, some weeping openly. Claire pressed her hands to her face. Maddie clapped so hard her sketchbook tumbled to the ground. But before the applause faded, another voice rose from the crowd, harsh, unsteady. Harold, the bus driver, had stepped forward. His cap was clutched in his hands, his face pale. "There's something you all ought to know," he said, voice shaking but determined. The crowd hushed instantly. Harold's throat worked as he tried to find the words. I've been driving that bus 20 years. I watched Matty struggle every morning, wheels stuck in the mud, and his voice cracked. I did nothing. I sat behind the wheel and told myself it wasn't my place. Truth is, I was scared. Scared because I had already lost my own boy, a soldier I couldn't save. And I thought if I stayed quiet, I wouldn't break again. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Emmett felt his chest tighten, knowing the cost of what Harold was confessing. But, Emmett, Harold's voice steadied now, rising with conviction. He did what I should have done. He walked off his porch and into the mud. He saw Matty when I couldn't. And when I saw Claire's post online, I sent it out to a widows group, to forums, to anyone who listened. I did it because I couldn't save my son, but I could save this. He spread his arms toward the barn, the gardens, the pots alive with children. The silence that followed was electric. Then Matty's small voice pierced it. You both built a ramp for me, one with wood and one with words. The crowd erupted cheers, sobs, applause that shook the fields. Hammond himself bowed his head, his lips pressed tight as if Matty's words had struck deeper than any speech could. Emmett turned toward Harold, his throat burning. Without thinking, he stepped down from the stage and pulled the older man into a rough embrace. Harold stiffened, then broke, sobs racking his shoulders. Two men who had carried their grief in silence now shared it in front of the world. And in that moment, the farm was no longer just Emmett's. It was a sanctuary for all who had lost, for all who needed to build something from broken pieces. As dusk fell and the last notes of the bugle echoed over the fields, Emmett stood at the edge of his land. Children's laughter carried on the wind, mingling with the rumble of tractors as volunteers planted under the fading sun. Matty rolled up beside him, handing him a fresh sketch. This one showed not just a ramp, but an entire farm alive with people, soldiers, children, widows, farmers standing together. In the center was Emmett, taller than he had ever seen himself, arms wide like a guardian of the land. Thank you for seeing me, Matty whispered again. Emmett swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the horizon. For the first time in years, he felt something more than sorrow. He felt a legacy beginning, and though the storm of grief had once nearly buried him, tonight the farm sang with life. What had begun as a ramp in the mud had become a bridge, one that would carry countless souls from despair into hope.